let's bring up our authors. First is Michael Wolraich. There's right there. Okay.
Where am I sitting?
Anywhere you like.
And Sara DiVello. And someone making her third appearance at the Lambs.
Join already.
Please welcome Debby Applegate. And when Debby had her launch party here for Madam, someone said, well, why a book about brothels and prostitution? I said, well, who are the best customers? The Lambs. So I'm going to turn it over to Debby.
Thank you. The Lambs always paid well and tipped well. That's all I heard. That's it is my third time. It is a true joy to be here freeloading off of your hospitality one more time. One of the great things I know, since there are so many authors and readers here, is that when you get to do a book, when a book finally comes out, you spend so much time alone, all of that time alone, and certainly for me, I thought that I had become friendless by the end, and my social life had dried up. I'm sure you are more reasonable people, but one of the pleasure was getting to meet both of you. Actually, this is the first time I met Sara. I just found her on the internet. But she has a fabulous new book out, which you will see. And Michael, right in my wheelhouse, and I don't know exactly how we met, but...
Oh, I cold emailed you. I pestered you. I said, you
found
had
me on the internet.
She wrote about Vivian Gordon in her book that I'm wrote about extensively, and completely covered it and had access to this archive in Colorado, I think it was. And I was like, I don't have time to get to Colorado. And it was like some private archive. And so I said, and there was, so I emailed you to ask you, what did you find there? What, not only did you respond to me, you sent me all of your notes on Vivian Gordon.
Yes.
You came and to Harlem and met me for lunch. You said hey, I'd like to blurb your book. I'd like to do some,
I didn't know you then.
I'd like to do events with you. It was amazing.
Yeah,
it was amazing, and I was still it was in the middle of writing it at that point. So I had.
You had that scared
She's
look.
amazing.
You had that scared look in your eyes at the time. Yeah. But and so it was especially nice, and I'm so happy to take your email and so happy to find you because as anyone who cares about a place like this, the cultural influencers of the past are not always remembered. And so to find people who knew and cared about these two women, Dot King and I keep calling her Virginia, and Vivian. I know it's Vivian. I don't know why. My Polly Adler's ghostwriter was Virginia. She's my best friend in my head. I'm sorry, Vivian, whose real name was Benita, so that also is confusing. Dot King, I'm sure, had a real name too. Yes.
Anna Keenan. Yes.
Anna Keenan. So what you enter when you enter this world of the Broadway Butterflies is, yes, some of them are performers, some of them are dancers, chorus girls, aspiring actresses, or actual grand actresses, but there are also many young women who did not make it, but they stay in the Broadway firmament. As I was just saying to Michael the other night, that the old saw was you arrive as a flapper, you become, if you stick around too long, you become a gold digger, and if you really stick along or too long, you become a whore. And I'm sorry, that's the kind of language we might use here tonight, but I'm the worst offender. So what I would like, because these figures are probably not familiar to you because they did, in fact, die far too young. I thought I would ask you both to start by telling us a little about each of your butterflies and why the story attracted you. I should also say, I just jumped right in without any kind of introduction. Sara has written a memoir called, if I'm right, Where the Oh My Am I?
Yes.
As I switched from being a publicist PR person to yoga. Turns out a cutthroat world. And Michael has been a journalist for a long time, but my favorite new book, which I have not actually read, but I feel was prescient, say the title because it's a good one.
Blowing Smoke.
No, but got the full title.
Oh, I don't even remember.
Oh,
the
I
full
can do
title.
it. I
Okay,
can
you
do it.
I
Go ahead.
hate the title. I had a much better title before.
Well,
my
it's
publisher
called,
got rid
I'm
of
sorry,
it.
I'm just going to have to say it because I loved it so much because it felt, in fact, entirely relevant despite being published in 2010. Blowing Smoke, Why the Right Keeps Serving Up Whack Job Fantasies About the Plot to Euthanize Grandma, Outlaw Christmas, and Turn Junior into a Raging Homosexual. As you can see, it did a lot of good. Thank you for that warning.
Yeah, people live
So, Sarah, I should also say one last thing, which is, Sarah, you are dealing entirely in fiction, but it is really not. It is really based on real things. And you, of course, have written a nonfiction book, but there's a lot of fictionalizing in it, and it's hard to trust facts. No, I don't mean in your book, but in this world. There's a lot of storytelling and a lot of lies. So it's a mix of facts and fiction all the way around. So, Sarah, do you mind starting?
Sure. So my book, Broadway Butterfly, is entirely true. It is a true crime, but I wrote it in the style of a murder mystery. So I did a genre mashup. It is about the unsolved murder of a scandalous flapper named Dot King, who was found murdered in her bed on the morning of March 15th, 1923, on West 57th Street, wearing only a lace negligee that barely reached her knees, which was only one of the many shocking things that proceeded to shock and scandalize first New York and then the whole country. In the process of the investigation, led by the head of the NYPD, Detective Coughlin, and covered by the lead crime reporter, who just so happened to be a woman at a time when less than 20% of women worked outside the home. That is Julia Hartman, one of the 6 pioneering women of journalism at the turn of the century, a name that everyone should know and nobody actually knows. She covered the case. And then I tell the story through 2 other points of view as well. Frances Stotesbury, who is the daughter of the wealthiest man in Pennsylvania, one of J.P. Morgan's founding partners, J.P. himself, and the murdered woman, Dot King's closest friend, confidant, and maid, Ella Bradford. So the investigation proceeds to reveal characters within Dot circles of friends that run from the gangster underworld, Arnold Rothstein, all the way up to the White House. So you can't make this stuff up. So it took me 10 years, and the book came out on August 1st.
Her book is great. I highly recommend it. The Polly Adler biography is also amazing. So, my book, which I hope you'll read and enjoy, is about, in part, a woman known as Vivian Gordon. But that was, as Debbie pointed out, not her legal name. She was Benita Bischoff. She had been, she came from Indiana, she was a performer in her teens. She was on the vaudeville circuit, going up and down the East Coast. Not a big successful actor. She met her husband, John Bischoff, and they settled down and had a child in Philadelphia. Vivian Gordon was devoted to this child. That was sort of became her whole life. But she also, unfortunately, transferred her own ambitions onto her daughter, whom she taught to dance and who was a very talented dancer. So her husband disagreed about whether she should be on the stage, because this girl, who was also named Benita, was on the stage in Philadelphia. Her mom wanted to take her to New York for the big time, to Broadway. Her husband disagreed. They separated. Vivian Gordon brought her daughter to New York, checked into a hotel, near Times Square, and her daughter was doing tryouts. And then something happened that changed her life, and ultimately had this butterfly effect that changed New York City's history. So she was, on March 9th, 1923, she was arrested for prostitution. She was sent to the women's court, which was in Greenwich Village. It's now a library. It's like a beautiful red brick building on 6th Avenue. There was a jail there where there's now a community garden. And these cramped cells with iron cots with no mattresses. she was, on her lawyer's advice, hoping for mercy. She pleaded guilty. She did not receive mercy, despite being a first offender, which meant she should have been paroled. Despite the fact that she had a young daughter, she was sent to a reformatory upstate, Bedford Reformatory, in Westchester, and still a correctional facility there. And there she learned, first of all, she was branded now. She was no longer could get respectable work. Second of all, her husband divorced her and got full custody of her daughter, whom she was never allowed to see again. So she was heartbroken by this. She also, as she confided to her parole agent, suspected that she had been framed by her husband and who had conspired with the vice cop. So she became very bitter. She needed to make a living on the outside, and she learned an awful lot of things at the Bedford Reformatory. So she started off as a prostitute, high-end prostitute, because she was, as Debbie will talk about, the brothels in New York, but they had these salons, and all these intellectuals would come, and so Vivian Gordon was a very intelligent, very cultured woman. She played music, she painted, she wrote poetry, she read widely. So she established herself in these salons, and she branched out into other ways of earning money from rich men. What they called at the time was gold digging. She would meet rich men and live off their largesse for a while, and then after the affair was over, she would often blackmail them. And then she created a whole business out of it. She had cabbies and busboys at hotels who would steer prospects to her room or to her table at the nightclub. And she also recruited, a number of younger women. She called them her young 49ers. And she, taught them the fine art of gold digging. Told them about how to get their information, for these men, and we can use it. She was involved. She made a fair amount of money. She invested in stocks and real estate. She loaned money to gangsters. She financed a bank robbery in Oslo, Norway, of all places. But all this time, she sort of nursed her bitterness and her anger against, towards her ex-husband, towards that cop, who had, taken her daughter away and ruined her life, and kept, looking for ways. Should I keep going? Or
Let's get to the murder part that was advertised, because both of these women, what these women share besides flexible morals and a talent, they were very pretty, and a talent for flirting and reeling in men, was that there is that works for a while. But as you begin maybe to lose your looks, or maybe you have been around the block a little too long, you either become a mistress, and God willing, which, if I recall, is what happened with Dot. But even that, if you're not getting paid in stocks and bonds and your own apartment, that's not steady work either necessarily. And then you find yourself, well, now what, right? And am I correct that Dot also had some blackmail issues? Am I right?
She had a side hustle. We all had a side hustle. So Dot King was known as the most beautiful woman in Manhattan. She was a professional model, a cloak model.
Wait, sorry, may I interrupt to say that when cloak model was often a code word for a prostitute, but not full time, and it was often because in the garment industry, all the modeling was done right up close. You would, men would come up and feel the fabrics and see how well it fit, and you would often be asked to go out with the buyers and that sort of thing afterwards. Sorry, not to cast aspersions, but
Yes, and that is absolutely true. She was an actual cloak model, but as Debbie rightly says, that modeling included parading around the showroom. And when the lonely gentleman traveler, here on business from out of town, needed a companion to have witty conversation with, would often may invite some of the young ladies to accompany him to a lovely dinner, a lovely expensive dinner. And so Dot made an acquaintance with a woman who was known for making strategic introductions. She was having lunch with this woman at the Hotel Brevoort, and she had caught the eye of a certain gentleman who she became a kept woman, so his girlfriend, and he paid for her rent and all of her living expenses and her clothes and her furs and her 2 cars and her maid and the garage where the 2 cars were kept, because something's changed in New York, but something's done, and one of them's parking. Right? Still not easy. And so he would, visit rarely because he's busy with his, wife and family and business ventures. He's running a multi-million-dollar business. But what is interesting is that Dot was, I think some people would be happy with that. They're like, this is enough. Dot was not one of these folks. She wanted more. And I think at a certain point she became tired of being a kept woman and tired of being at the her men's whims. And so it just so happened, and I'm giving a little bit away here, but it just so happened that her landlord was none other than Arnold Rothstein, who was the drug kingpin and head bootlegger in New York City, and was running, and the drug trail ran from New York City down through Atlantic City, where Nucky Johnson of Boardwalk Empire fame would then truck it inland to Philadelphia, and then it would go from there out west to Chicago, and that's how booze and then eventually drugs ran, during Prohibition. She lived in his, in one of his many apartments, in one of his, I believe, 49 LLCs that he was, laundering money through. And so at a certain point, Dot was 2 weeks before she was murdered, went to Atlantic City by herself. Women did not travel back then alone. You at least had to have, a lady friend with you.
How old was she? She was in her early mid-20s.
So this is the best part. She was 29, but she told everyone she was 27. And I feel like
there's a lot of fiction rolling around.
Well, if you don't have, these are the days, driver's license, some states have them, some states don't. There's no photo. There's barely photos on passports. You can be who you want to be. There's no social media. There's no social security numbers. It's very easy to change yourself and to disappear. So 2 weeks before she's murdered, she goes to Atlantic City by herself, and then the next weekend she goes back. And I'm wondering who the heck's going to Atlantic City in the beginning of March. That's not beach weather. Not beach weather. And so, I start to put all of these clues together.
Wow. And so,
and I actually just want to add that Dot, when her gentleman, when her sugar daddy, and really interestingly, the term sugar daddy comes from this case. So we've all heard the term sugar daddy, sugar baby. We've all used it. That you only know that term. We only have that term because of this case. The word had never before appeared in print. So while it was used vocally in the very cool, hip city that is New York, and in the even cooler, hipper Broadway district, that was not known to the rest of the country and certainly not the rest of the world. But when, the parlance of Broadway started to make an appearance in newspaper articles about this case, as the investigation unearths all the dirt about, all the dirt about the Broadway saunterings of certain kind of people, that term sugar baby and sugar daddy come to the cultural front. So when her sugar daddy would visit, he would give her $700 in Liberty bonds and cash and cash for the to pay the house expenses. But what's really interesting is that 2 weeks before she died, Dot deposited $10,000 into one of her 3 bank accounts around the city, and there's a 17x rate of inflation. So that would be $170,000 in cash, and she withdrew $17,000. So she's moving large amounts of money, and that's way larger amounts than what her sugar daddy's giving her. A smart woman, King.
No, they're not smart enough to live. And tell us. So what happens? She lasts a little bit longer. She's not a whole lot older. Although we don't know exactly how old she is either when she goes, do we?
Right.
No, we do actually. She was 39, but nobody thought so. She had, they initially described when they found the body, they described her as like in her 20s, and then it sort of shifted up to 30s. She had plastic surgery.
God forbid.
In 1923.
In like around 1930, probably.
What'd she
1929.
done?
Yeah, what'd she have done?
I didn't get the details. They found. I think it was along. Somebody can tell me what this would be called. I think they found around the hairline. They found.
Yeah.
A 29?
No, 39.
No, she was
Mine's
39.
29.
But it
Mine's
was
29.
around 1929. when they were doing this.
Bold.
Bold.
So, but it was a few years later. When was Dot King?
King was killed on March 15th, 1923.
23. So that was actually 6 days after
She
David
was
Gordon
arrested.
was arrested.
Yes.
And in fact, King, her murder was really one of the first really big Broadway Butterfly murders. That got huge press. Between the two of them, they could easily have covered the front pages for years if you added it all up.
Yes.
And it's fascinating. I didn't know that was the origin of the sugar daddy or the popularization. Vivian Gordon was known as the woman with 500 sugar daddies. After she was murdered, they identified her as this woman. She had been known. Ever since Bedford, she called herself Vivian Gordon, but they identified her by her fingerprints from the original arrest. They found, and some subsequent arrests, and they went to her apartment and they found these black books. Some of the black books had, a list of men's names, many men's names, or it was like around 500. In fact, with figures, indicating money,
Annotated.
I would like to read that.
There was another black book with names of a number of young women and their proportions and naked pictures of them. So these were her, she was running an escort service as well. But then what was, even more sensational there were 3 diaries. And so covering her kind of last 3 years of life in New York, where she named, a number of these. So these men were these were prominent New Yorkers. Some of them were gangsters, some of them were Arnold Rothstein was among them. But some of them were, there were judges and, and politicians.
Isn't the Flower King one of her, the Flower King of New York?
There wasn't the Flower King. There was. The baking.
Joralemon or whatever it was, the baking.
Joralemon was a chemist.
Yes. Too many.
I
shouldn't have gotten. But but the sugar daddies get their own reputations in the press when they can identify them. Although, as I'm sure you discovered, the press does not like to talk about men in the same manner that they were willing to talk about the women. I'm sure you both discovered that, right?
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting is that in my case, the police protected the real name of the sugar daddy because they didn't want to damage his sterling, reputation. And they said with completely straight face, well, he's a family man, and in spite of the fact that he was, the last one to see King alive, and she was half his age and not his wife, this family man's reputation had to be protected at all costs. And what I found even more interesting, they dragged her reputation through the mud. And also, as Debbie pointed out, her real name, she was born with the name Anna Keenan. And she did not feel that fit her. And so she took the name Dorothy King or Dot King. And the police insisted on calling her Anna Keenan, while at the very same time covering the real name of her sugar daddy. And it was so interesting to me that they gave him the pseudonym of Mr. Marshall. They kept calling him Mr. Marshall. So they would call him a fake name, but they wouldn't call her by the name that she had chosen. And that sort of got to the nucleus of how they were treated differently.
And so in Vivian's case, part of the reason her case, I mean, as we all know, there are young women who live at the edges of society who meet bad ends quite often. They don't always splash out in this manner, and they are not always treated as some sort of symbol of the city or as some sort of diagnostic criteria for how well we are doing as a society. In your case, Vivian's case, it was that she was involved with the municipal scandals. Would you say that's why it became such a big to-do?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So my book is actually two narrative threads. One narrative thread is the murder mystery of Vivian Gordon and about Vivian Gordon. The other thread is an anti-corruption investigation that was initiated by the governor of New York, whose name you probably know was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he launched this investigation, and he appointed this former judge named Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury was the great-great-grandson of the Right Reverend Samuel Seabury, who was America's first Episcopal bishop, and who's now probably remembered because he tangled with Hamilton Revolution. But Seabury was not the judge. Samuel Seabury was not a theologian. He was, but he had that manner. He was very pompous, very moralistic, very clean cut, didn't swear, always like perfectly hair combed, and so people, because of his ancestry and because of his manner, people behind his back, they called him the bishop. So hence the bishop and the butterfly.
So why do you think King's murder came out so large? It was such a big to-do.
I think it came out because we had a coalescing of multiple factors. So we're coming off of World War I, which of course then they called just the Great War because we didn't know a second one was coming. And on the wake of that, the first pandemic, which was the Spanish flu. So millions of American boys have died in Europe. Then they come back. Then 500,000 more Americans die from the pandemic, the first pandemic. Then there's an election, and white women were given the right to vote. I want to note that is a right that was withheld from Black and Indigenous women until as late as 1965. But white women have just been given the right to vote. So all of a sudden there's all these new voters, and there is an election, and Warren Harding is elected, and then he comes in and he's the most scandal-ridden president, least liked, most hated, scandal-ridden president whose cabinet members are impeached multiple times. And he holds that ignoble mantle, holds that crown until 2016. And I said what I said. I write nonfiction. It is what it is, right? So we have turbulent times. And in the midst of all this, we have electricity, we have cars, we have... so all of a sudden the cities are lighted up, and women who have never been able to get out of their towns unless their train is going that way can now get themselves places and can see where they're going. So it feels a little bit safer, and we have a little more mobility. So we spawn what is called the new American woman. And women are, 20% are flowing into the workforce, primarily, in domestic service, sales, factories, and telephone operators. And so in the midst of all of this, people don't like change. So there's this clench of like, the girls should stay on the farms, they should stay home, father's house to husband's house. And, all of a sudden women are cutting their hair. What? Women have never cut their hair before. Don't bobbing your hair. And actually the reason Dot King had to make her own living is because she got married on her 17th birthday, which is just so young and hopeful. And it's shocking to us that no one could have anticipated it didn't work out. She moves home, and her father has died, so her younger brother is now the head of the household because we're living in a patriarchy, of course. And she bobs her hair and dyes it blonde, and he says, "You look like a tramp," and throws her out. So she is out on the streets of New York City by herself with no family, no high school education, and has to find a place to live and make a living. So, and many other girls are finding their way in this. So as, we're having this new freedom, the hemlines are rising because of the Great Migration, where 7 million Black Americans are leaving the legally segregated South and flowing north and east to Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, we have jazz music. So now in order to dance to jazz music, you got to lift those hemlines up. You got to be able to move those legs, right? So hemlines are rising, haircuts are happening, women are getting out, and people don't like change. So there's this big clench. So when Dot, with her bobbed blonde hair and her short hemlines, who lives on her own, gasp, who drives a car by herself, shock, is murdered, there's this feeling of like, see, we knew it was dangerous.
Am I correct that she was strangled with a stocking also?
No, that's
right?
another
Sorry.
one. That was
Sorry. So many.
That was Dixie
That's right.
Dixon. Dot King
that's right.
was chloroformed.
Right. Sorry. Louise Lawson, that was the one.
No,
Sorry.
Dixie Dixon was the
Sorry.
with the silk stockings and the little dog tied to her leg, which was weird. I know, I always feel bad for the dog too. So when I think there's this moment of extreme cultural shift, which everyone causes clench in people who aren't comfortable with change, and then a woman who is a symbol of that new change comes to a bad end, there's this feeling of like, we knew it, you should have stayed home. And she became this symbol of the dangers that can happen to women if they leave the safety of their fathers and husbands, protection, in addition to the fact that then as each salacious detail comes out, well, now she lives in Arnold Rothstein's building. Well, now we know who her sugar daddy is. Well, now it goes all the way up to the White House and everyone's like, it's like getting the popcorn. You're just eating and reading.
And I was going to say in
That's why it
Vivian's
went
case,
viral.
because Vivian's case comes out 7 years later, 7 years later, so 1930. But the lessons drawn have a lot more to do with men, if I recall. Not that women, of course, but am I correct that men?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Vivian Gordon, she was a pretty bad apple at that point. She was a criminal
It might
figure.
have happened to Dot if she'd lasted longer.
No, it wouldn't. Keep your mitts off, Dot, your bad thoughts.
They probably all would have worked for Polly one time or another.
Not my little Dot. Not my little Dot.
Sorry.
But yeah, with Vivian, it was about her because she was also this, it was this very sexy, fascinating case. But it was also about the New York City authorities and the cops and
And the men.
And Tammany.
I was going to say, but also the men who went to her saying, this is why you don't step out. This is why you avoid women like this. And that will teach you a lesson, although, did it?
It's, no, it wasn't remembered long. That wasn't the lesson that people got. Let's put it that way.
But Tammany did change, yes, somewhat, yes.
So yeah, but what happened was that what had kind of right before her murder in 1930, this judge Samuel Seabury, who was leading this investigation, uncovered a plot, a conspiracy in the women's court that I mentioned before down in Greenwich Village to frame innocent women for prostitution, for money. They would, the cops would, these vice cops, they would, essentially they would plant evidence or they would arrest these women under dubious circumstances. They would bring them down to the women's court. They would drop them off with a bondsman. The bondsman would charge the women a very large fee. Then the bondsman would deliver the women to a defense attorney, probably in the same office often. And the defense attorney would charge a much larger fee and say, if you pay my fee, I will get you off. And if the woman had the money to pay the fee, then the defense attorney took it. He distributed kickbacks to the cop, to the bondsman. He probably, bribed the prosecutor, possibly the magistrate. And the woman would get off and, have lost some money, but her reputation would be intact. If not, well, then she would be convicted and sent to the reformatory. So Samuel Seabury discovered this conspiracy, and this was huge news. I mean, everyone knew New York City was run by Tammany Hall, this old political machine that everyone knew they were corrupt. Everyone knew they were getting money everywhere they could. But, cops framing innocent women for prostitution, it was huge news. And Vivian Gordon was, she was reading the papers, and it validated what she had said back in 1923, especially because one of the cops who turned out to be crooked was the cop who arrested her. So she said, now I'm going to get my revenge, and now I'm going to get my daughter back. And she, she wrote to the Seabury Commission, and she said, I've got a story to tell. They invited her down, and she, had this meeting and was, advised to collect some more evidence, and, they would, see if they could use it. She, somewhat inadvisedly, sent letters, gloating, triumphant letters, to her ex-husband.
Oh God.
It was not a good idea to go around bragging that I'm going to take you down.
You saved that for later.
Yeah, maybe in the question, maybe we can grab it if you want. But yes, and to the vice cop. And she did not meet again with the Sabri Commission because 5 days later, after that meeting, she was found dead in a gully in Van Cortlandt Park with a dirty clothesline wrapped around her neck.
So we could talk about murder and crime and dirty talk all night long, as we have. But I thought I might open it out to the questions because I'm sure some of you respectable people would like to know how this works. First of all, any questions, David?
I have a question. When she went to Atlantic City, do you know why she was going to Atlantic City?
So the question is, why did Dot go to Atlantic City, when the March weather is not friendly beach weather? So my suspicion is that because she lived in Arnold Rothstein's building, and because that was the drug trail, and because she had these very large deposits that could not be explained. No, not only woman, but no man is making money like that. So Julia Hartman, for instance, just by contrast, is making $15 a week as a newspaper reporter and living quite comfortably on that. No one has $10,000 of cash who's on the legal side of things. It just isn't, unless you're JP Morgan or his partner. Like, that's just not happening, especially not for a girl with a high school education and no visible means of income. So my suspicion is that she's working for her landlord, Arnold Rothstein, in collaboration with his business partner and her ex-lover, Nucky Johnson of Boardwalk Empire fame.
Yeah, Arnold Rothstein liked to come off as a tough guy, but he used women all the time as drug mules, as bait for blackmailing. He had a lot of bucket shops, illegal or essentially barely legal stock betting brokerages, and he would use women into his gambling houses. So especially as he got more and more that a lot of women, he could easily have been moving drugs for him. That would have been quite
I'm absolutely sure she was. And I think the other, Arnold Rothstein, they called him the brain, credited with fixing the 1919 World Series for the Chicago White Sox, continues to get into all sorts of legal trouble, but nothing ever sticks to him because, they raided his gambling house and it sounds all too familiar. 39 people are arrested, but nobody testifies because he pays for all of the bail and the legal fees of all 39 people. So, they could never get anyone to testify for him. Additionally, his best friend in all of the world, by his own admission, just so happens to be the only son of the U.S. Attorney General, Draper Daugherty, and they're up at Lindy's, talking all night, and both of them say they're their best friend, and they're each other's best friend. So if your, best friend is the only son of the U.S. Attorney General, ain't nothing sticking to you if you don't want it to.
Except for a bullet.
Yeah, he didn't
that
last.
stuck to him.
He did not last as long as Vivian did. I can tell you that. I see a question in the back.
Yeah, you might have answered this when I was trying to get next door. Why the term butterfly?
So just like we have social butterfly, we still use that today. A woman who flits around, or we'll say that gender neutral. Actually, a person who flits around, not having deep relationships. A social butterfly visits a lot of flowers. Is known. So this referred to not just a social butterfly, but in the very chic New York City, but in the very chic.
Was it a coincidence that you both?
So it just was they would just, there were many Broadway butterflies, just like we have many social butterflies. There were many Broadway butterflies who inhabited the very cool area of the Roaring 40s where the theater district is.
Yeah, Broadway was not, now we think of Broadway as exclusively theater. But at the time it was also included all the nightclubs and the speakeasies and the brothels.
The gambling house. It was as much as the reporters like to call it, as much a state of mind that took its manners and morals from theater and gambling, which were at the time, gambling I guess now is our national sport, but entertainment was not respectable at the beginning of this decade. It really wasn't until movies made movie stars so glamorous and so rich that it became something that you just wouldn't let your daughter become an actress if you had any. And one of the things that's really notable about all three of the women we've written about, and I'm sure it's still true, but it is especially true back then, if you do not have a father or a father figure to keep you to keep your house together, to keep you protected, you were much more likely to find yourself in these positions if you did not have a father, to go back to the patriarchy question. Other thoughts? Yes.
How did you find your butterflies?
Do you want to go first, Michael?
Yes, I've told this story a few times. It's a little embarrassing, but
I'm so glad he went first. Leaning in.
When I look for a book topic, I sometimes do what I call wiki surfing. So it's more of like it's not kind of research so much as brainstorming, where I'll just kind of go through Wikipedia and I'll see a link that looks interesting and I'll click that, and then I'll find another one, and I'll sort of get, it'll take me in this unpredictable path. So in this case, I was kind of, thinking about FDR's time as governor, because everyone knows all about his presidency, but people don't know much about his 4 years as governor of New York, and there's a good reason for that, because it's not a common. Basically, his 4 years as governor of New York were preparing to run for president. But one of the things that happened during these 4 years were the Seabury investigations. And so I'm kind of playing around with those, and in one of these pages mentioned this woman, Vivian Gordon, whose murder played a role in these investigations. And I was, who's Vivian Gordon? And I clicked on the link, and, no page. This page does not exist. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So then I started, actually digging in and doing some research, and read about this, her sensational murder, and I was like, wow, that's a good story. And then I also, as the more I dug into it, realized that it wasn't just some random, murder. It was so sensational and so connected with those Seabury investigations that it played a big role in what happened afterwards, and what, these investigations were just cataclysmic. They changed New York City. They brought down Tammany Hall. They brought down a mayor, and helped, propel FDR to the presidency. And, call it the butterfly effect. But Vivian Gordon's murder, helped catalyze the outrage that New Yorkers were feeling, because many of them, as Debbie and I talked about a lot, many people just assumed the cops bumped her off to keep her quiet, and so they were just furious with what was happening.
So I found my butterfly in what started out to be a completely ordinary day and turned out to be extraordinary. So I'm from Philadelphia, which is why I was so excited to hear Philly earlier. And I was home visiting my family for Thanksgiving 10 years ago. And, the day after Thanksgiving, ain't much happening if you're not hitting the Black Friday sales. And we were not, because we're not insane. So we're eating, our leftovers, and we're chatting with my aunts and uncles and cousins. And my uncle Ed was reminiscing that, back in the 60s, he and my Uncle David, after high school let out, they used to sneak over to the old castle where they'd sneak cigarettes and drink beers. And I was like, oh, that's so funny, the 60s. Wait, what castle? And because my aunt lives in a very, very modest, suburban development where everything is a split-level ranch circa 1950, and every single house is identical, where you're like, which one is it now? Oh, that one. And he was saying that, in the next suburban development over, there used to be this grand Gilded Age estate, and it had been razed to the ground in the 1980s, but ruins exist still today. Well, needless to say, as a history minor who minored in history because I love architecture, I needed to see the ruins. So we piled into cars and we, caravan over, and there in between the tulip beds and the Subarus and the little red wagons of the next suburban housing development are the ruins of a great castle. There's headless statues of Diana and Zeus. 6 50-foot pillars that used to be the grand entrance that now are just in the middle of a field. The edges of a fountain, a still completely perfect belvedere with carved pineapples, and then a staircase going to nowhere. And it was so bizarre, and I chase ruins everywhere. I've been to Rome, I've been to Greece, I've been to Chichen Itza in Mexico. If there's a ruin, I'll go see it. So I'm standing in suburban Philly, and I'm like, what is this place? So I go down the research rabbit hole. I learn everything about this family. Everything about this home had 147 rooms. It was bigger than the White House, the third largest private home in the country. 3 floors above ground, 3 floors below, 24 bathrooms, 28 fireplaces, a staff of 70 full-time gardeners just to maintain the 300 acres. Everything about them. I'm like, well, that's cool, but DiVello's not in the castle writing business. That's interesting, but great. But I couldn't stop thinking about them because I could sense there was a story here. And 3 months later, I went back and I found a 1953 book called, Scandalous Philadelphia, the 100 most shocking things to ever rock the Quaker City. Hint, it doesn't take much to rock a Quaker. Right? But there was a reference.
Shaker's harder.
I'll shake that Quaker. But there, in one paragraph was one sentence that said, in 1923, the Stotesburys, then a grand Gilded Age family, and there's still the Stotesbury Regatta, rowing competition every October, found themselves, in a tight position when they found themselves associated with this murder. And all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew with every bone in my body that I needed to write this story because as a yoga teacher and a bit of a mystic, I believe that storytelling is an exchange of energy, and that we as storytellers open ourselves to be a conduit for a story, and the story can come, and it's a partnership between the story and us. And I had found my story, and my story had found me.
But how did you decide to do it in fiction? That's a big difference.
So it's not fiction; it's totally nonfiction. It's
I'm
true
sorry.
crime.
I thought
That's okay. It's
totally. Wow, I'm so sorry.
No, you're totally fine. I love fiction. This just happens to be true. So it's told in the style of fiction. So I did a genre mashup. So everything in it is 100% true. The dialogue is pulled from historical record, except for some responses where there were no responses on historical record. But that somebody didn't just ask a question and then it went silent, right? Someone asks you a question, the other person responds. So everything in there is totally true, but except for the responsorial dialogue and for 2 scenes that I had to fill in. And so the editor said, I think this is fiction. And I said, I've spent 10 years of my life in the bowels of the New York Public Library. I can assure you this is not fiction. And, it's really interesting because Devil in the White City by Eric Larson has a lot of conversations between the murderer and the victims in the oven room. And those are made up, because he's not alive and is not on the court record. And yet he is nonfiction. But I'm fiction, and I'm okay with that. But I'm just telling you, it's all true.
That's not.
I'm sorry.
Totally okay with that. That is I'm not okay about Eric Larson.
I mean, of course, many people think it's fiction, and arguably it is. That's I think what's interesting about writing narrative nonfiction is there's not fiction, nonfiction. It's not how it works. There's a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I did not invent any dialogue in my book, but I'm quoting these reporters who are quoting people's memories who said so and so said this, and I don't think every word that I have in there was actually spoken. So
they also played fast and loose.
Yeah.
Reporters back then were there was very different then.
and you have to fill in gaps. And so, sort of based on how much they do, I guess, it sounds like this was maybe incorrectly kind of,
Michael's right, there's a spectrum, but they can't shelve you on a spectrum. There's no shelf space for a spectrum, so you have to choose fiction or non, you have to choose what you're going to write based on where they're going to shelve you. It always comes down to where they're going to shelve you. And so I had to make that choice, and I'm totally happy with my choice because the style of the storytelling is 100% classic murder mystery, whodunit. Most true crime is in a very journalistic voice, and you hear the voice of the teller. It's very journalistic, and it's very factual. And mine, you are in the people. You're in Julia in her chapters, you're in Coughlin in his chapters, you're in Ella in his chapters. So I did something totally different, and it's never been done before, and they didn't know what to do with me. So they put me in fiction, and I'm totally cool with that.
I'm sorry for not
No.
quite recognizing that. We have lots of questions. How long do you want to? It's 8:00 now. How would it? Five more minutes?
We started.
Okay. Let me start with you, and then we'll go to you, Diane.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful presentation. Michael, I have a question for you. The books that you've written, the 2 books that you wrote previous to this were very much, non-fiction, not necessarily storytelling. To me, this seems like a real pivot and a deliberate choice in style. And what does the form that you've elected to do now allow you to achieve that you couldn't do previously?
So I don't see it as a full-on, it's a great question. I don't see it though as a full-on pivot as much as an evolution. My last book, Got a Reasonable Man, I didn't even know it, I didn't call it that, but it was narrative nonfiction. It was all politics, there was no murder. But I did tell it as a story. It was a story of the evolution of Theodore Roosevelt and his battles with his sometimes ally, sometimes opponent, senator named Bob La Follette. And I was, there was a fair amount of dialogue in it, and I was telling it as a story. So here, and that's, so I came from the politics side, and that's why, that's how I ended up with this book, because half of it is this history about FDR and about New York City. Then with the murder brought into it, then it really kind of crystallized. Like, yes, this is narrative nonfiction, this is what I want to be writing. And I think it was, not something completely different, but it was, more narrative. I focused more on the story. And really try to make this, because I absolutely agree with you. Like we think in stories, we understand things with stories. Stories are what draw us in. And I love history. I want to be telling history, but it's not going to be a dry academic history. It's going to be a story that tells the history.
I just had lunch with my literary agent today who said, listen, nobody reads nonfiction anymore. They don't even need narrative nonfiction. And I was like, great, so glad I came in early. Getting a good pep talk from you. Diane.
There's a wonderful scene at the end of your book with this showdown between FDR and Jimmy Walker. And for years, FDR is looked at as a dilettante lawyer, yet his cross-examination is really quite brilliant. Is that based on newspaper accounts, or is there a transcript of that showdown that they have?
There is a transcript.
That was based on actual line-for-line transcript?
Yes, what I presented was very condensed, because there were, I think it was like 3 weeks of hearings. And so they just to fill everybody else in, as the investigation expanded, because of what happened with the murder, Seabury just went nuts. He started interviewing, investigating everyone in New York City, everyone in government, and eventually, discovered a slush fund, $1 million slush fund that Mayor Jimmy Walker had.
$1 million in, $1 million then.
$1 million.
Wow.
Gifts from friends, he described it.
Who just wanted him to have a little something because he worked so hard.
Yeah, they said this. They were like, one guy was like, well, my kid asked me, like, how does he have enough money? And I was like, that's a good question. I'm going to work on this.
Yeah.
Some of the transcripts are really funny, actually. So first there was a hearing down between, first there was a showdown between Seabury and Jimmy Walker, down in the state Supreme Court building, which is the big, looks like a Roman temple with a big column, the Law and Order building, the building. So they had this big showdown, and Jimmy Walker arrives. There's like thousands of people in Foley Square, and he gets out of his limo, and he's wearing, he dressed fabulously. He's like completely blue suit, blue tie, blue shirt, blue handkerchief. And people were cheering because they loved him, and they had 3 days of kind of him battling with Seabury, who was like, this relentless, stern, inquisitor, and Jimmy Walker's just like throwing out wisecracks and, getting laughs from the audience. So then the Democratic convention happened, FDR got nominated, and then FDR said, okay, Jimmy Walker, come up to Albany. and Seabury came too, and that's where this grilling happened for like 3 weeks, and yes, that's all from transcript, and you know that's kind of the finale of the book that I won't spoil.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The person who asked it clearly knows their way around a legal transcript, and I just want to say I had never read a court transcript before, and as part of my research I obtained from the Congressional Library, also learned there is a Congressional Library, a court transcript from when former Attorney General Harry S. Daugherty is standing trial, and from that I was able to pull direct quotes from his I strongly suspect his lover, Jesse Smith. I didn't know that he was gay, but he was. His ex-wife, Jesse's ex-wife, Roxy. I just love Roxy. So Roxy testified, and it's also so funny when you're reading transcripts because people, I don't know if you've noticed, don't speak in full, complete, tasty sentences. So it's literally like, could you speak up louder, ma'am? Witness clears her throat. It is brutal to wade through a transcript.
So wait, he was gay, the Attorney General's
so
daughter, and his son was a drug addict, right? I mean,
he was not a drug addict.
Sorry.
He was, as many people coming back from the war, traumatized. We didn't have the word PTSD. We wouldn't have that for a long time. But he, like a lot of people, drank to deal with whatever he had seen and dealt with, and he was a womanizer and a philanderer, and his father had arranged a marriage with the daughter of the senator of West Virginia, and he wasn't, that was not working for him, so he was gallivanting around New York City with showgirls, one in particular, Pearl Barrymore. And when it is revealed that he's Rothstein's best friend and that Rothstein is Dot King's, landlord, and his dad, the Attorney General, announces 3 days later, Harding's going to run again. It's an embarrassment for the campaign. So they sent, and Draper won't shut his yap. I started calling him in my mind Chatty Draper. Chatty Draper won't shut his yap. And so Daddy Daugherty sent him to a sanitarium in Connecticut to shut his yap. And so he was not, I found no evidence that he was a drug user or even a habitual drug user, or any drug user, or even an alcoholic. They just didn't want him talking about Dot King.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, one last question, and then, yes, sir.
Mike, I've noticed in history a lot of scandals kind of come to light at the same time as financial collapse. And you're talking about something that happened in 1930. And how do you think that the financial situation in New York might have impacted the reaction to the murder of your heroine?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it was very much connected. And the reason, not with the murder itself, but with that Seabury investigation, without the stock market crash, there would have been no Seabury investigation. When times were good, when the money was coming in and New Yorkers were out partying at the speakeasies and the nightclubs and the brothels.
The stock market
Was like booming. Everybody had a lot of money. Everyone was from Polly Adler's autobiography, a bender, the spender,
Champagne Charlie.
Champagne Charlie. There was all three of them.
Exactly.
And so people were not paying too much attention to the fact that the city was run by a completely corrupt regime with mobster ties because things were good. Then the market came crashing down. All of a sudden, people lost all their money. They weren't having nearly as much fun as they'd been having a few months earlier. And they looked around and they're like, "This city sucks."
There's a great line.
These guys are,
There's a great line from a reporter at one of the tabloids who says, maybe the reason they're all picking on the cops is because they still have jobs. And so in fact, I know we've got to close, but I want to end.
Has a question.
Oh, sure,
One
please.
last question. Is District Attorney Tom Dewey in any of your 3 books?
Oh yeah.
He's not in my book.
No, he's a baby for when she does.
Which is in your book?
Yeah.
His desk is in my office.
Very nice. We're going to take a picture of you in
Well, if
that.
you join the club, you can sit at it.
I'm going to close. That's so nice. Although he was not a lamb, I cannot imagine. I'm going to close with a bit of poetry from Vivian here. It is only a brief bit of one of her longer pieces of doggerel. We did an event the other night in Brooklyn with the editor of Untapped Cities, who also is a Juilliard-trained cellist. I see you did not bring a trio for us to play, but they played one of her poems set to music, or set to music. That's probably not exactly the way to say it, but yes. But I do not play, I do not sing, but I can recite, and I think you will all appreciate this line from a Broadway Butterfly. I'm a lady of the evening with a morning glory's beauty. The payment for my raiment I get in devious ways. When some big and wealthy brute wants to love me 'cause I'm cute, I admit that I submit because it pays. I'm a lady of the evening, just like Cleopatra was. The Queen of Sheba also played my game. Though by inches I am dying, there's no use in crying. I stay and play, 'cause I'm that way, a moth that loves the flame. So there we are. Thank you so much to everyone for coming out. Thank you guys.